Today, we're talking about one of the most infamous true crime cases in America, the story of Betty Broderick. This is a case that continues to divide people even decades later. Some see Betty as a cold-blooded killer, while others see her as a woman who was pushed to her breaking point after years of betrayal, humiliation, and emotional turmoil. As we go through this case, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and become a sensational sinner. Betty Broderick, born Elizabeth Ann Basilia, was born November 7th, 1947. So she was a Scorpio. So me as a Scorpio, trust me, I can relate with Betty as her story unravels and the emotions and the intensity. So she's definitely the true definition of a Scorpio, other than seemed like she never had no moment of unbotheredness, okay? She grew up in Bronxville, New York. She was the third of 6 children born to Marita and Frank Basilia. Betty was raised Catholic, and as she later recalled, she was being trained to become a housewife since the day she was born. Betty attended Maria Regina High School in Hartsdale, New York, and graduated from Eastchester High School in 1965. Mary then went on to earn a degree in early childhood education from the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx. In 1965, a 17-year-old Betty met 21-year-old Dan Broderick at a party during football weekend at Notre Dame. At the party, Dan was sitting across the table from Betty, and he asked Betty to borrow a pen, which she did. He then wrote his name on the tablecloth. He wrote Daniel Broderick Thomas III, MDA, and the A was in parentheses. So Betty asked him, "What does the MDA means?" He told her that he had just got accepted into medical school, so the A stood for almost. So medical doctor almost. Betty thought that was funny. During that weekend, Betty told Dan as a joke that when he moves to New York the following September to attend medical school, she would show him around New York. So she told Dan to meet her at the Grand Central Station by the clock. She provided a certain time and day, but when Betty did not show up on that date, Dan called her. And after that phone conversation, they began dating. But before that, they were just writing letters back and forth. While dating Dan let Betty know early on that he would not be told what to do. Also, while dating Betty, Dan discussed marriage a lot. Betty even said that Dan had become obsessed with her, like a stalker. And literally, as soon as they started dating, Dan wanted to marry her. But Betty told Dan she wanted to get her degree first before she could even think about marriage. But Dan told her she can do both, school and marriage. But Betty had her own goals and timelines set. And in December 1968, she graduated college, and then she went on to marry Dan the next year on April 12, 1969. After the wedding, Betty moved in with Dan in his dorm room. And at that time, Dan took over the finances. Shortly after their honeymoon, Betty became pregnant. Betty worked throughout her whole pregnancy up until the day the baby was born. Betty worked so hard because they needed the money. Dan was a full-time medical student, and he had jobs here and there, but Betty always kept the job. On January 24th, 1970, Betty gave birth to her and Dan's first daughter, Kim Broderick. And in 1971, she gave birth to another daughter, Kathy Lee. After that, Betty became pregnant with a baby boy, whom she delivered alone because Dan was away on a ski trip with friends. And you would think Dan would have left his trip to be by Betty's side, but he didn't. And unfortunately, the baby died 4 days after birth. After the birth of her deceased son, Betty went into depression and attempted to take her own life. Seems like at a young age, Betty was kind of like going through a lot so far with the kids and being pregnant, being a mother. Dan is in school. And to me, it's coming off like Dan is just a little insensitive to me. For him to even schedule a ski trip, knowing that his wife is that far along in her pregnancy. And now she's finding herself giving birth alone, and he did not rush to be by her side. So I'm not surprised that she fell into depression, and it's unfortunate that she attempted to take her own life. Dan finished medical school, but then he wanted to go back to school to become a lawyer because he wanted to gear towards medical malpractice. So he attended Harvard to obtain his law degree. Now, throughout those years, Betty still maintained a job. She did babysitting day and night and even sold Avon to support the family. Betty stated she didn't mind Dan going back to school because she wanted him to do whatever he wanted, and it was her job as a good wife to support him. While Dan would attend school full time, Betty was the primary caregiver to the kids. She would be in charge of the cleaning, the cooking, and making sure the home stayed nice and quiet for Dan to study. Betty felt as though Dan could have went to school part-time and also worked to help support the family financially, but because he wanted to attend Harvard, he went to school full-time. And because Harvard was so expensive, they used loans to pay for his education. And as they say, teamwork makes the dream work. Dan finally finishes his law degree, and in 1973, they moved to San Diego, California, into some brand new apartments. Betty took a job teaching at a local Catholic school, and Dan began working for the Great Carey firm. Landing that job opened up a new world for Betty and Dan socially. They hung out with other attorneys at the firm and their wives and became the true definition of socialites. Financially, things were better than before, but not great. Betty ended up quitting her teaching job and began working nights as a hostess at a local restaurant so that she could spend more time with the kids. Betty also became pregnant twice, back to back, but she terminated both pregnancies. She stated Dan never wanted to discuss birth control. And well, we all know what comes along with that. More pregnancies. Betty gave birth to Dan Broderick IV in 1976. Around that time, the home they were renting caught fire, and they used the money from the insurance claim to buy their first house in La Jolla, California, on Coral Reef Avenue. At the same time, they were still paying on furniture that was ruined in the fire and had to take out a second mortgage in order to buy the home. But they were homeowners. When Dan Jr. was about 10 months old, Betty decided to open a home daycare. That way, she could bring income into the family as well as spend time with her children. Betty loved children. Betty's biggest complaint around that time was that she wished Dan had spent more time at home. He was always working or networking. And Betty understood the absence when Dan was in school, but she expected that once he started working, he would have more time to spend with her and the children. To work on their marriage, Dan and Betty attended a marriage encounter that year. And a marriage encounter is kind of like what we would call these days a marriage retreat. So they attended the marriage encounter through the Catholic Church. And Betty was able to voice her concerns with wanting Dan to spend more time at home. But nothing changed. Dan was too career driven. He told Betty that until he reached his financial goals, that he would not change and that she just needed to stick by him. Betty agreed to stay by his side. At the marriage encounter, Dan and Betty received homework to improve the marriage. They were to spend 10 minutes a day to improve intimacy, but Dan said he was too busy and just didn't have the time. Now, at some point, He must have found the time because in 1979, Betty and Dan had their last son, Rhett Broderick. In 1981, Betty and Dan are doing great financially. They're traveling and staying in the most expensive hotels. Dan is buying property and his career is thriving. Dan left the Great Carey firm in 1978 to open his own private practice. It wasn't easy at first. Dan and Betty lived off credit and Betty's income during the first 2 years of Dan getting his practice established. But he did it. And Betty knew he would. Betty always said that if anyone would make it and be successful, it would be Dan Broderick. And Betty is now the modern day housewife. She drops off and picks up the kids from school and practice. She has lunch dates during the day with her friends. She has her hair and nail appointments, and she even does charity work. Life is great. But unfortunately, although their social and financial life is great, their marriage is suffering. Betty was still yearning for closeness with Dan, but Dan just picked up even more jobs, which kept him away from home. He began teaching law courses on Saturdays and was on the board of directors of the Bar Association. So at the end of 1982, when Dan informed Betty he hired some help, she was relieved. Betty thought, finally, Dan gets it. He can spend more time at home. But Betty didn't like the help Dan hired. He hired the beautiful 21-year-old receptionist who only answers the phone, by the way. And she worked in Dan's building. Her name was Linda Kokina. Betty felt as if Linda was underqualified and wasn't a good fit to help with Dan's workload. Linda couldn't even type. And to add insult to injury, at a party prior to Dan hiring Linda, Betty overheard Dan refer to Linda as beautiful, which Betty thought was kind of odd at the time because Dave had supermodel friends and Dan never referred to any of them as beautiful. So now the fact that Dan has hired Linda causes Betty to now see Linda as a threat. And after Dan hired Linda, rumors started to brew around town of an affair between them. People would say they seen them downtown holding hands, having lunch together often. In 1983, Betty and Dan were millionaires. Now listen, I know they had to be excited. Listen. Even if the marriage problems was going crazy, I know that they had to add some type of excitement. According to Betty, from 1981 to 1983, their income increased fast. Betty even leased herself a Chevy Suburban and put a personalized license plate on it that says, "Load 'em up." And the meaning behind the loaded up is she would always have a truckload full of kids, both hers and others, taking them to and from outdoor activities. That year, Dan and Betty also gifted a judge friend and his wife a 3-week all-expense paid trip to Europe. Now, I say Dan and Betty, but it was Dan's idea and his initiation. But it was during that trip, Betty noticed a change in Dan. She stated normally on trips, because Dan worked so hard, he would play hard on vacations and they would have a lot of fun. But on this particular trip, Dan was withdrawn and Betty thought maybe it was because of work stress. In the summer of 1983, Betty took the kids on a 5-week camping trip through the Pacific Northwest. Dan visited Betty and the kids twice throughout the whole trip. On one visit, he was too tired to enjoy time with his family. And on the second visit, Betty stated Dan was acting like a jerk. At that point, she just told him, if you're gonna be here, then be here. And if not, just go home. When Betty and the kids returned home, Dan's demeanor changed, but for the worse. He didn't even greet them at the door. And when they arrived, he was not happy to see them. The very next day, Dan and Betty attended a wedding, and according to Betty, Dan informed her of what was bothering him. Betty stated Dan told her he was unhappy with everything: their house, their lifestyle, her, and the children. According to Betty, Dan also told her he thought their house was tacky, their friends were boring, and he thought she was old, fat, boring, and stupid. Now listen, I don't know if, and this is really no pun intended. I don't know, maybe Dan had a death wish. For you to tell a human being that you happen to be married with that they're old, fat, boring, and stupid, I think that's the ultimate disrespect. And to be honest, I knew Betty loved him, but because of his behavior, along with those statements, I think I would have been planning my exit at that moment. At that moment, I think that would have been enough for me to be like, okay, you hired the receptionist, your mood is changing, and I'm all of these bad things. Yeah, it's time to plot, plan, and execute. But so after that, Betty stated Dan's attitude around the house, it didn't change, and he wanted to make major changes. He wanted to live in a mansion, and he wanted a more glamorous lifestyle. Betty received her real estate license in order to save money on the house her and Dan was to buy. And Betty did whatever she could to please Dan. She lost weight. She got braces to fix her teeth. She did things to remove the wrinkles from her face. She grew her hair out to look younger. And she even quit doing the things she loved in order to cater to Dan even more. Betty even went so far as to try and untie her tubes in order to give Dan more kids if he wanted them. Now listen, marriage is great. Marriage is a great thing. But if you think I'm going to be doing all that to keep a husband, absolutely not. But listen, Betty gets an A for effort, okay? It seems to me it was like one-sided. Betty liked and loved Dan way more than he liked and loved her. She's giving more. Why he's just like selfish. While Betty's becoming selfless. And it's unfortunate. And after doing all of that, Betty just had one request. Now, y'all heard all what I named that Betty just did to save her marriage and to please Dan. And all she asked was for one thing in return. One. And that was for Dan to fire Linda by October 1st. Because something just didn't feel right in her spirit about Dan hiring Linda. At this point, Betty has asked Dan numerous of times if he was having an affair with Linda. And he denied it every time. Dan told Betty she was imagining things. October 1st came and went, and Linda was still employed by Dan. And Dan's behavior took a turn for the worse. He became cruel towards Betty. He started to sneak out of the house, and sometimes he wouldn't even come home at all. On November 7th, 1983, on Betty's 36th birthday, I would like to believe that Betty had high hopes that even though Dan had been acting weird and mean lately, that on this day, he would show up for her and he would choose her and make her happy. So on that day, Betty had a dinner party with the people she knew who would always be there for her kids. And as the night went on, Betty realized Dan wasn't coming home, and she was right. After that realization, Betty fell into a deep depression. She put the kids to bed and she cut her wrist. Dan arrived home the next morning to find Betty sleeping in another room in the house. Betty is now even more suspicious of Dan and Linda's relationship. And she asked him again, was there something inappropriate going on? Dan reassures Betty that nothing is going on and he's not having an affair. Dan even suggests Betty seek help because he felt she was having a mental breakdown. So the next day, Betty sees a mental health counselor alone. Dan did not accommodate her. And for that moment, things seemed to calm down and they got better. Betty confided in a friend about the Dan and Linda situation, and Betty's friend suggested Betty go by Dan's office and make her presence known. So Betty takes her advice, and on November 22nd, 1983, which was Dan's 39th birthday, Betty decides to pay Dan a surprise visit at his office. When Betty arrives with a gift and champagne in hand, she found Dan's office trashed with balloons, confetti, cake, and streamers from an apparent party. And Dan was nowhere to be found. When Betty asked where Dan was, she was told that Dan and Linda had been out of the office for most of the day. And when Betty walked into Linda's office, she found an older picture of Dan before they were married on Linda's wall. And right then, Betty knew that Dan and Linda was having an affair. When Betty went back home, she was determined to throw Dan out of the house. She took his clothes, threw them in the backyard, and burnt them. But not his favorite ones. Now for me, that still shows the care, the love, and even the respect that she had for Dan. In her spirit, she's now feel as if Dan is having an affair. Her intuition is telling her that. So she takes his clothes and she burns them, but not his favorite ones. The favorite ones would have been the ones that I would have burnt first. But that's just to show the respect and love that she still had for that man. Okay? So when Dan arrived home, he was drunk and ready to eat the birthday meal he requested Betty make for him. Roast beef and chocolate cake. But Betty stopped Dan at the door to let him know the jig is up and that she know that he's been sleeping with Linda because she went by the office. Dan denied the affair. He told Betty him and Linda had lunch earlier that day, and then they went their separate ways. Dan said he went off to depositions for the remainder of the day, and Linda probably went shopping. Betty believed Dan. She felt like she had made a mistake, so she let Dan in the house. After that night, Dan started to come home every night, and him and Betty started looking for new houses. Although Dan had stopped all the entertainment and he even canceled their annual Christmas party, things were calming back down. Now, in my personal opinion, you see that you surprise him on his birthday. He's not in the office. Linda's not there. His weird behavior, but he's convinced her that it's no affair, and she believes it. But she's still not paying attention of the moves that he's making. He's canceled all your social events, which means he's not showing you off. He's not taking you to parties. Y'all are not going out. He even canceled y'all annual Christmas party. To me, that was Dan preparing himself and reinventing himself into the single Dan. In my personal opinion, Dan has been, he's planning. In mid-1984, word spread that Betty and Dan was house hunting. So they received an offer on the coral reef house that they were currently living in. But because of an issue with the foundation, Dan wanted to get the house fixed before they sold it. So while the insurance company did the renovations, in September 1984, Dan, Betty, and the kids moved into a rental property where the rent was covered by the insurance company and the lease was for 8 months. But unfortunately, the marriage couldn't make it past the lease. Dan came home February 28, 1985, and told Betty he was moving out. He moved back into the coral reef home alone. And at that time, Betty's checking account was in the negative. Like I said, Dan had been planning this all along. And to be honest, even with the crack foundation, I kind of think that could have always been a plan too, to get Betty out of the house, out of the main house, get her into a rental, and then that way he can reside at the main house. Mid-April 1985, Betty set up a meeting with Dan to discuss finances. She wanted to know what was the plan because at this point, Dan's reason for leaving was that he needed space. He never mentioned separation or divorce. And when Betty asked if he moved out because he was having an affair with Linda, he denied having an affair or even dating Linda. Easter 1985, Betty took the kids on vacation. When she returned, due to construction around the rental property, the rat problem she had before had gotten worse. She called Dan for help and informed him that the rat problem was worse. He told her congratulations and hung up. Between the separation with Dan, the rat problems, the financial concerns, and taking care of 4 kids full time, Betty became a nervous wreck. She was very short-tempered around the house. June 1985, the lease was up on the rental, and according to Betty, during her and Dan's separation, they were still making plans to purchase their dream home. On June 28, 1985, Betty and Dan purchased a new property. On the property was a house they planned to demolish and build their dream house on. Dan told Betty she would be in charge of the whole project. Now, during this time, you would think Betty and Dan would live in the new home together. But Betty stayed at the property alone, living out of a suitcase and sleeping on the floor. Because Dan still needed his space. So Dan and the kids lived at Coral Reef, and when it was time to move forward with the demolishing of the home and build the new home, Dan stated he didn't have the money to pay the workers at that time because he was in a cash crunch. And so he needed to wait until September. So according to Betty, she went along with that plan because she didn't want to nag Dan. And she refrained from making any demands because he didn't like to be questioned. Now, Dan didn't like to be questioned. That is funny. According to Betty, in October 1985, she received divorce papers from Dan. Shortly after receiving the papers, Betty received a call from her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law informed Betty that Dan had brought Linda Coquina to a party given by Dan's brother. Betty called Dan and demanded answers face to face. Dan drove over to Betty, and that's when he finally confessed. He admitted to the affair with Linda. He told Betty she was right all along about the affair. Betty felt relieved that she finally knew the truth, but she also felt taken advantage of. Betty was furious with Dan, but Dan suggested Betty go into a mental institution. I find that crazy. Now for me. You have been gaslighting Betty for, at this point, months, years. You've been gaslighting her, saying there's no affair. And now you're finally admitting to an affair that you've denied for a while. And then when she has a human emotion, you suggest she goes into a mental institution. I'm just trying to figure out for to say Dan is this smart guy. I don't know. Maybe he just, for me, it's just the manipulation of it all. She finds out she have a human emotion. To be honest, they didn't say, that when she found out she tore her house up, broke stuff, threw stuff at Dan. I wouldn't have been surprised if she did. But they never said that. It was literally she was having, probably just being emotional, yelling and shouting. And he suggested she go into a mental institution. I find that to be very crazy and wild. Mental gymnastics. Mind manipulation, in my personal opinion. Betty refused to check herself into a mental institution, and the battle of Dan and Betty's bitter divorce began. Betty began searching for an attorney, but according to Betty, because Dan was such a prominent lawyer in the area, it was almost impossible for her to find an attorney that wanted to go against him. And ultimately, she had to find a lawyer in the city nearby to represent her. During the divorce, Betty lost custody of the kids, and Dan and Linda began living together. Linda's voice was even on the answering machine. Okay? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine you have 4 kids, you don't have your 4 kids, and then you're calling the house to speak with your 4 kids, and you hear your husband, not new girlfriend that he found and maybe is a nice lady. You hear the mistress that he was cheating with on the voicemail while your kids are home. Now listen, you can be the most sane person. I don't know who wouldn't have a problem with that. I don't know what person wouldn't. Okay, so just paint that picture, okay? I think that was tacky. But I also think because Dan knows that Betty is an emotional woman, he did that on purpose. In my personal opinion, I feel like he knew that would rile her up, and he purposely let Linda be on that voicemail just to trigger Betty. And unfortunately, she took the bait every time. And because of Betty's erotic behavior, Dan had to take out a restraining order against her. Betty would leave numerous of vulgar voicemails on the family's answering machine where the kids could hear. She even went by the house one day and found a cake that Linda had made and smeared it all over Dan's bedroom and clothes. But Dan wasn't an angel either. According to Betty, she found a letter where Dan wanted to have her divorce papers served to her at an important women's luncheon at their daughter's school in an effort to humiliate her. And after the confession of his affair with Linda, Dan sent Betty some flowers for her birthday. And the card read, "I hope you start to feel better soon. Love, Dan." Betty was furious because she wasn't sick. She felt like Dan was once again playing mental games because she wasn't imagining things. The affair was real. Pending the divorce, Dan agreed to pay Betty $9,000 monthly, which seems like a lot. But Betty had to buy appliances, furniture, pay lawyer fees, and not to mention the house she lived in was supposed to be torn down. But now that's not even an option, so repairs needed to be made. And sometimes Betty wouldn't even receive the full $9,000 because Dan would make deductions if Betty disrespected him, left crazy voicemails on his answering machine, or showed up to his house unannounced, breaking the restraining order. Dan ended up buying a home that him and Betty had earlier looked at to purchase, but he bought the home for him, Linda, and the kids. He brought all new furniture, and what did he do with the old furniture, you ask? He told Betty he no longer needed that junk and that she could go to the garage at the Coral Leaf property and pick whatever she wanted. How sweet. According to Betty, the only asset she had to her name that could generate some type of income was the Coral Reef home that her and Dan purchased. And somehow Dan was able to sell that property right from under Betty's nose, with just only a 4 hours notice. And when Betty became aware of this, she was furious. She drove to Dan's house demanding answers. But Dan just blew her off and threatened to call the police if she didn't leave. So Betty left, but she returned at a later time full of emotions. She drove her vehicle into Dan's front door with the kids home. So can you imagine these emotions? Trying to find a lawyer, having trouble finding one. The only piece of asset that she has is the property that she has with Dan. And he even has found a way to sell the property right from underneath her. So emotions are high at this point. So due to that incident, Betty spent 3 days in a mental institution. According to Betty, she was hurt with the way Dan was treating her. Like, this was the man that she trusted. And now he's cold, mean, and disrespectful towards her. And my thing is, listen, that's normally how it goes. When you're the new car, you get polished, you get washed, you get played with, and then when you are the old car, which I'm not saying that Betty is an old car, but that's how Dan felt about her. He found a new car, which was Linda. Betty is the old car. So what do you do when you have old toys, or old car? You disregard it. You don't play with it. You throw it in a corner. And then with the new car, that new car gets the attention, the wash, the vacuuming. And so it's unfortunate that although Betty had 4 kids for him, that he would treat her so bad like this. But it shows that he did not care, kids and all. And I do believe that Dan was very cold and treated Betty like she was nothing, disrespected her. He felt nothing for her. And unfortunately, because he felt this way emotionally, she could not handle it. Counseling was definitely needed for sure. In June 1988, a still married Dan proposed to Linda, and in 1989, after 5 long years, numerous of restraining order violations, thousands of dollars in lawyer fees, and many contempt of court hearings, Betty and Dan's divorce was finalized, with Betty receiving $16,000 a month in spousal support and a one-time cash-out payment of $28,000. Betty felt as if she didn't get her fair share, and Dan had hid assets with the help of his brother. Now, $16,000 sounds like a lot, but not when you're still paying lawyer fees and going in and out of court, because now there's a custody battle. April 22nd, 1989, Dan married Linda Kokina. People close to Dan requested he wear a bulletproof vest because Betty had made threats to kill him. But Dan felt Betty would never actually do it because he was worth more alive than dead to her. On November 3rd, 1989, Betty was served court documents from Dan, threatening to place her in contempt of court if she continued to leave lewd messages on his voicemail. Getting those documents pushed Betty over the edge. And on November 5th, 1989, everything came to a tragic end. Betty entered Dan's home using her oldest daughter's Kim house keys and fatally shot Dan and Linda while they were sleeping. After committing the murders, Betty called her daughter Lee and confessed. Betty said after years of fighting with Dan in and out of court, she just couldn't take it anymore and wanted it to stop. Later that day, Betty turned herself into the police, and she stated she was only trying to scare Linda and Dan and didn't mean to kill them. Betty even stated at one point that she planned on going to the house and killing herself in front of Linda and Dan. Betty's first trial in 1990 ended in a hung jury and was declared a mistrial. And it's reported that one of the jurors stated that they wondered why it took her so long. Now listen, that was tragic and it was unfortunate. But for the jurors to say they was wondering why it took so long, that just to show that even they felt the mental exhaustion that Betty must have been going through. In 1991, Betty was retried and the jury found her guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Throughout the years, Betty has done interviews where she stated that she's a lot happier in prison than she was in her marriage, and that prison was just what she needed because it freed her from bills and household chores. Now listen, I don't like household chores either, but I don't want to go to prison to avoid the chores. But that's how she felt. Betty had 2 parole hearings, one in January 2010 and in January 2017. They both were denied. The parole board felt Betty didn't show any remorse for the crime she committed. During the 2010 parole hearing, 2 of her kids spoke in her defense, while the other two spoke against her release. But despite the division, Betty stayed in contact with all 4 of her kids during her time in prison. And although Betty spent decades seeking parole, she was never released from prison, despite the support of those who believed she had served enough time. On May 8, 2026, at the age of 78, Betty died in prison. Her original cause of death was natural causes, but it was later reported as accidental due to an accidental fall that broke her ribs, which then led to septic infections. Betty's death brought one of America's most debated true crime stories to a close. Yet, even after her death, the questions surrounding her case remain. Where is the line between victim and perpetrator? Can justice and compassion coexist? And how should history remember Betty Broderick? Those questions that continue to divide people to this day. And while people continue to debate whether Betty was a victim of emotional manipulation or solely responsible for her actions, the facts remains that 2 lives were lost and multiple families were forever changed. Do you believe Betty Broderick was pushed to her breaking point? Or do you believe there is never a justification for what happened? If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss future true crime documentaries and reactions. Thanks so much for watching. Stay out of trouble. And don't forget, pour me some wine. I'm watching true crime. Bye, y'all.